This is the screencast for Chapter 4 of Digital Foundations. Um, in this screencast, we'll look at typography in Adobe Illustrator. And I usually deviate a little bit from this final file. We will do the heading with grid systems, but I like to create two paragraph text blocks because I like to show linking text blocks, and that's something that I didn't get a chance to do in the chapter, but that I teach in the classroom. So I'm going to set up a new print document in Illustrator. I'm just going to use a basic print profile with letter-sized paper. And I've got my tools doubled up over here so that you can see all of them. So you're probably used to seeing your tools like this. With my screen resolution, the tools kind of run off the page, so I'll keep them doubled up. And I want to start this the way that a lot of people would kind of start a project like this if they were working from scratch. So, it's good to do the exercises. It's great to follow kind of step by step all of the exercises, but it's also good to kind of think about how would I work on this if I were just coming to this on my own. So what we see when we notice, and if I kind of move this out of the way, and what we see when we look at the results file is the largest piece on the page is this big black rectangle and then grid systems. So essentially the heading with the big underline is the piece on the page that sort of takes precedence, it takes hierarchy. And so when you're working on a project, you want to put sort of the biggest thing on the page first and orient that item, because you will notice that as you're working on a layout, every single part of the layout relates to every other part of the layout. And that includes whatever it is that you're putting in the positive space and also the negative space. So I'm going to just kind of go ahead and place a big rectangle on the page. I'm not going to think about it too much. I'm just going to kind of do it by sight. And we'll just sort of say it was something kind of like this. Like I kind of want a big black rectangle. Let's switch my foreground, my fill-in outline colors, and then I'll go to my outline and press none. And I want that to sort of take up a majority of the page, but not all of the page. A rectangle like this allows for active negative space that kind of moves around the document. A rectangle like this cuts my page in half, and so now I have two passive negative space kind of fields. And in this particular document, we're going to go for some active negative space, so I'm going to move that over a little and open up my white space or my negative space. I have my black rectangle kind of running off the page. If this were printed, everything up to the border presumably would print, although most printers will give you a small white margin. So in most cases it would actually print kind of more like that. Anything that I want to hit the edge of the page, I run it off the page so that I don't have any kind of fear of having it print with this tiny little gap. And I would just assume that in this case, if I would get margins, I would just trim them after the fact. Once I have my rectangle, I'm then going to use my type tool to set up that heading grid systems. Now, the type tool can be used in two ways. You can click the type tool, and you can click once in your document and start typing. And whatever you type, bunch of letters, whatever it is, if you hold the shift key and you pull on an anchor point, you can scale that text, and it scales up because this is just a single line of type. The other way to use the type tool is to click and drag. And if I click and drag, I make a text block, and when I go and type whatever I'm typing, right now, a bunch of letters, those letters fill the text block only. If I hold the shift key and scale this, you'll notice that my type doesn't scale, and instead my text block scales. I'm going to Command Z, and just to show, that means that I can reshape my text block, but that would have no effect on the typography in my text block. So you want to make a text block when you're working with paragraphs, and you want to make a single line of type when you're working with headlines or display type or something that just lives on one line that you're probably going to want to transform. My selection tool, I'll just select this and press delete on my computer. Same thing here. So I'm going to make first my headline, which means I'm just going to click once and type in grid systems. Then I will, for a moment, work with my selection tool. Now I'm going to switch over here from Essentials mode to Layout. And that's going to allow me to see my character panel and my paragraph panel down here, which is a little bit kind of falling off my page probably, so I'm just going to pick those up and make them a little more visible. And it also gives me one-click access to styles if I were to use those, which I probably won't get to in this screencast. And the Align panel, which comes in really handy for stuff like this. I'm also going to go ahead and keep my layers open. I may or may not need that, but I feel like it's always good to have that open, so that will open up there. In this chapter, I used Gill Sans for the typeface. So because I knew that, I could go ahead and just double click in that character panel and I could start typing in Gill and Gill Sans will come up. If you don't know what font you want to use, and remember you have to select your type block before you do this, you can click on the set font family pull down menu, and then you can see in the character panel you can actually see what your fonts or what your typefaces would look like. So that's a benefit over instead of using it here in Essentials mode, and even here if I click on my type, you might actually see your paragraph tool. Let's do that just so I can show it. In Essentials mode, if I would double click this type, you'll see your font face up here, and if you click, you'll get your list, but you won't see an actual preview of what those font faces look like. So it's kind of nice to see them. You could, of course, always click into the character panel from here, and that would give you a way to see them. But I'm just going to go ahead and work with layout mode. Okay, I've got Gill Sans loaded as my typeface. Now I'm not going to worry too much about exactly the size of the type. I'm just going to use my selection tool. Always hold the shift key as you scale. Holding the shift key constrains the proportion and sort of maintains the integrity of the typeface. By holding that shift key, each letter is scaling proportionally. If I don't hold the shift key and I do something like this, this is a very different typeface than what Gill Sans looks like. This is, in fact, very ugly and kind of stretched and skewed. So we always want to hold that shift key as we scale anything, but especially typography. Okay, I'm going to leave it someplace around here. I kind of like the size of this in relation to the size of my block and in relation to the size of my page. And if I take a look, I'm just going to select that type. If I take a look at how big it is, just by random or randomly, I have ended up setting my typeface at 73.05 points. So I'm going to go ahead and double click that and just change that to around 72. It's pretty close to 72. 72, it's kind of a round number. It's an even number. Just as I'm probably not going to do the math, but if I would do the math, it's an easily divisible number, whereas 73.05 is a little awkward. Like I said, everything on the page relates to everything else on the page. So if you think about this idea of relationships, we really want to think kind of, I hate to say numerically or mathematically, but we do sort of want to think about how items on the page relate to one another. So now that I have grid systems, I'm also going to, instead of using the regular Gill Sans, I may go ahead and use the bold version. Of course, once I switch to bold, now I get a much larger kind of type block. So instead of 72 now, I might drop this down to 64. Right, this is a very typical way of working where you're just sort of making these choices, and each time you make a choice, you may need to make another choice. Ultimately, I'm going to have this sit kind of something like that, maybe something like that. But before I do that, I want to kind of take a look at this font, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit on my typeface. When you're working with the type tool, and you scale your type really large. Pretty much anything over 18 points in most typefaces. Let's say in this case you're making a header or you're working with some display text. At a larger type size, the kerning of the type in some cases, and actually in most cases over 18 points, it kind of starts to fall apart a little bit. And so what I'm going to do is I just press T on my keypad to get to the type tool quickly. And what I need to do is look very closely at the kerning and adjust it, because what I'd like to see is even space between my letters. So kerning is the space between letters, and there's actually a few words. You could use kerning, you could use tracking, you could use letter spacing. I reserve tracking or letter spacing for kind of the space between all of the letters kind of evenly. If I were to open or close the tracking, I would maybe give it more space or less space. And I think of kerning more as the space between individual letters. So what you'll need to do to adjust the kerning is exactly what I've just done. You'll need to get your cursor in between the letters, and you just want to watch out. I want to kind of back out of this for a second. You want to watch out for accidentally clicking and making a new type path when you mean to select into a type object. So right now with my cursor, if I would click right here, I'm going to make a new type path, which is not what I meant to do. Watch it how my cursor changes. If I click in here, see how the path is now underlined in blue, and my cursor also changes to a more sort of editable type tool. So now if I click here, I'm actually clicking between the letters. So if you look in this first word, grid, the space between the G and the R and the space between the I and the D, those two spaces are pretty even. The space between the R and the I is quite compressed. So I'm going to put my cursor between the R and the I. I'll hold on my Mac the Option key, and I'm going to use the right arrow, and I'm going to open that space up with 2 or 3 Option right arrows. And I might make a decision about whether it's 2 or 3 right now, right? So I'll do it twice and let go, and then try it 3 times and let go. So that's a little bit more even in terms of getting the sort of spacing of the letters a little more even. On a PC, it would be Alt left arrow or Alt right arrow. Now that I've opened that up, for my taste, that's a little too open, and I tend to keep my type a little more closed. So I'm actually going to move everything over by 1 for just a slightly more tightly kerned word. Now that I've done the first word, I need to do the second word, and I'm going to keep kind of this spacing in mind. So I'm just going to Option left arrow to tighten anything. And there are some places where I don't need to do that. In fact, there usually will be a lot of places where you don't need to do that. And in mine, pretty much I felt like the first 2 between SY and YS, I needed to kern. I needed to tighten that a little. I think the rest of it is kind of looking okay. And this is something, I feel like I do this in stages. I might tighten this piece a little tiny bit. I'll do this for now and I'll leave it. And then as I'm working, I might look up later and go, oh my goodness, I've left something, or something needs to be tighter. So I feel like I never see it perfectly the first time around. And you can see I'm still making adjustments. Now I'm going to zoom back out with Command 0 so that we can see all of this in one page. I'm looking at it now at 73%. You always want to take a look at 100% to see what it looks like. 100% is going to give you really the view of a closer idea of what it will look like on the page. You'll never really get a true view. You really need to print in order to see what your type looks like. Printed type always looks different than type on the screen. Just know that as a guarantee. So once I've kerned my big headline, with my move tool, I've just moved with the arrow keys. Remember, shift arrow will move something up by 10 units. Shift down arrow will move something down by 10 units. Just up arrow or down arrow will move it up and down by 1 unit, and I can use left or right arrow as well. I'm going to take a look at now a couple of things in terms of relationships. First is, where is this in relationship to this piece? So I'm just going to use my shift left arrow to move this over, and I'm going to align this. I'm just going to nudge it with my arrow. Again, I'll zoom in. Just kind of align this with the kind of visually. And I could use a guide and get really precise, or I could just kind of eyeball it for the moment. And now I'm going to use shift right arrow, I think twice. And so I just know that that's sort of indented by 2 shift right arrows, or 20 units, which for me feels just fine. I don't mind having a little maybe extra space on this side because we're going to kind of left align a lot of stuff on this page. So I'm not really thinking right now about center aligning the headline on the block. If I were going to center align, what I would do is I would select this block. I would actually make sure it was hitting just the page. I would look at where that center anchor point is, and I would line this center anchor point with that center anchor point. I'd probably pull a guide out to do that. Okay, but that's not what I'm interested in right now. I'm also interested just in the idea of relationships in general, and so what I might do with this black box that I just sort of willy-nilly dragged out is check out the size of it compared to my type. So if I look at it, I'm just going to sort of lay it on top of my type. It's pretty close. It just happens to be pretty close to the size of my type. It's a little tiny bit bigger, so I'm just going to scale it down so that it's exactly the same as my type. This is not, it's not a huge deal, but it's something that you'll know you did that, right? Like, and it just feels right on the page to have these relationships between all of the objects. So now I feel like these 2 pieces are kind of relating nicely. I'm actually going to select both of them by just marqueing over them with the selection tool, and then Command G will group or object group just to group them together. So now I have just one grouped heading up here. I could always ungroup it and change it later. I can still press T for the type tool. I can still click in there between the YS and Option right arrow to give that a little space. As I said, I always end up doing that over time. I never see it right the first time around. It might be because I'm not wearing my glasses right now. I like that as an excuse, but the truth is I'm just really lousy at it, and it takes me a while to look at it and really see it over time. Now, I also want to see where is this block relating in terms of the rest of the page. So now I will press Command R, Control R on a PC to turn on my rulers. I will Control click or right click right on the ruler and change my points to inches. So my units of measurement are inches. Just a little easier for me to see and to think about. And then I'm going to zoom in again and just take a look at where is this lining up. Look at how my box, and again, I just did this based on what felt right in the moment. I ended up making a piece that extended almost to like a 2-inch margin on the page, but not quite. So I'm actually going to just pick this up. Since they're grouped together, I'll just click on it and just right arrow nudge that over so that I am now officially at exactly 2 inches on the page. So 2 inches just happens to be kind of my margin space on the left side, which margin isn't really the right word, but the amount of negative space going on the left side. It didn't have to be. It could have been 1.5 inches. It could have been 1 3/4 inches. I'm just sort of working with my intuition when I first sort of laid this down, coupled with a sort of an eye for detail and measurement and sort of thinking relationally about the page. Again, it doesn't make a huge difference, but now that I have this at 2 inches, as I work with the rest of the material on the page, I might work in units of 2, right? I might work in these sort of relational units of 2. Okay. What I like to do now is place a couple of paragraphs on the page, So for that, again, I'll use my text tool. And I'm going to just use some dummy text. So I will Command Tab myself over to Google, and I have already pulled up lipsum.com. That's lipsum.com. You can also just Google lorem ipsum or lorem ipsum generator. Lorem ipsum is just dummy type. In fact, you can read all about it here. It's dummy type that the printing industry has been using forever, basically since the 1500s. And it's great to use because as you have dummy text in your documents, you really don't want to use something like placeholder text goes here, placeholder text goes here, placeholder text goes here, repeated over and over again, because you'll start to see the repetition of that phrase. So I'm going to just generate a whole bunch of paragraphs of lorem ipsum. I will not use all of this, but I'm just going to copy and paste from the website. So I'm just going to select all of this and Command C on my keypad for copy, Command Tab to get myself back to Illustrator. And to make a block of text or a paragraph of text, I'm just going to click and drag and Command V like vector to paste. Now when I paste, notice that I'm still pasting with Gill Sans Bold at what I ended up at, 64 points. So I did actually paste everything in there, we just can't see it all at the moment. With my selection tool, I will keep this text block selected, and I will change Gill Sans from bold to regular. I will change 64 points to 11 points temporarily. And now I should see that I'm starting to see some of the paragraphs that I've selected. 11 points is a good starting place for body copy on the page. And again, this is for the situation where you intend to maybe print this out and hold it in your hand and read it. 11 points would be a little small for reading on the screen. A lot of websites for body copy will actually use 14 points or 14 pixels or something around there. Your default kind of medium text in the browser is usually set to 16 pixels, so we need larger type for reading on the web than we do for reading in print, and all of your font faces are going to be a little bit different, right? As you may have read about or learned in previous classes, your typefaces are built on X height, the size of the letter from the baseline to the top of the lowercase letter, and so some X heights are larger than others. So all of your font typefaces are going to be a little different in terms of what the right size is to use for readership. 11 points is a great starting place, and you can always print it and then check it out and decide if you want to drop it down a little bit or increase it. I'm just going to take a look at this. I'm going to sort of line this up with my G, and actually now might be a good time to go ahead and set a guide. So again, I'll zoom in, and from my ruler I'm just going to click and drag, and I'm going to make a guide right there at the edge of the G, and that's kind of where I want to set up my first paragraph block. And what I'll do is I'll just kind of take a look at where this is. I'm going to have this hit, my paragraph block hit the top kind of line there, and then I'm going to use shift down arrow, I think 4 times. Remember that we used the shift arrow several times over here, so I tend to use that shift down arrow, shift up arrow as a way to just measure out space on the page. Now, in thinking about how far down should I go with this column of text, I am looking at kind of this space, and I'm thinking about my margin space on the bottom of the page. So what I'm going to do, just to kind of be sort of precise about it, I mean, if I were to eyeball it, I would probably do something like that. But what I'm going to do is just take a rectangle, and with my rectangle, I'm going to measure out that space. And I'm just going to kind of check it. I'm just sort of curious to see. It's almost the size of this. So I'm actually going to go ahead and use that size. I might as well use that size. So that means I need to go with my down arrow just a couple more times, 3 or 4 more times. Okay, so now I have exactly this space between where my text block starts and where this was, and where this block ends. And then I'm going to take a look down here at what I have. I have more than one. I'm just going to hold down my Option key as I click and drag to make a copy. So maybe I will kind of aim for having it end about there. And we'll see how it goes. So if I would have it end, it should actually be right there. If I would have it end there, I would need a guide right here. And there's a few things that you should know. So now I've kind of set up my margin space on the bottom of the page. I will eventually go ahead and delete those. I'm just going to put those over here on my artboard for maybe working with later. So when I'm looking at a column of type, there are some questions that come to mind. How big should it be, right? This is far too long of a line length to have, decent legibility. So in terms of a line length is basically, in a text block like this, governed by how wide the text block is. And the general kind of rule is it should be no more than 3 or 4 inches wide if we're working in columns of text. Generally speaking, our eyes are going to kind of scan across the page. Your eyes move in static eye movements, and they're going to scan across the page. We have a capacity of moving about 3 or 4 inches across the page before the eye jumps back. And your eyes move this way. They move forwards and backwards, or kind of left to right, left to right, left to right. So if you set up your column such that it naturally is going to want to jump back at some place between 3 and 4 inches, then you are setting up your line length for legibility that sort of naturally meets what the eye wants to do. So I'm starting at, close to, if this is 2.5, I'm close to about 2 1/4. So if I would go 3 inches, so that would be 1, 2, 3. 5 1/4 would be 3 inches. 6 1/4 would be 4 inches. So, someplace in here is going to be fine. I want to set up 2 columns of type, and on this page, because I've given it so much space on this side, I'm going to have to work a little bit asymmetrically. I'm going to have one column be a little bit larger than another. So I'm going to set up one column like this. Let's see, 2 1/4, 3 1/4, 4 1/4. Let's just go. I feel like 5 is going to be too small, so let's at least go to 5 1/4. And then I actually want to go a little bit more because I'm thinking about the second column, and I want to have one be larger than the other. So maybe 5 3/4. And I'm just watching up here in the ruler where my text block kind of lands. Now that I have one block, notice in this block, and I'm not worried yet about this bottom margin because I'm not done dealing with this type block, but what you'll notice is I have 2 paragraphs, the start of a 3rd paragraph, and then I have this, let me zoom in on it, I have this little kind of plus sign. It's sort of hard to see, but there's a little plus sign there on that red box. And that red box with the plus sign is telling me that I have more type than fits into my type block. So I've kind of set up a type block by clicking and dragging with my type tool. And then I've pasted so much copy into it that it doesn't all fit. So instead of, what you might be inclined to do is go, okay, well, I have another type block that I'm going to make, so I'll click and drag and make my type tool. Then I'll go get my lorem ipsum, and then maybe I'll delete from here and paste into here. And instead of working in that way, the smart way to do it is to work with your overflow text, because that's what essentially we're getting at here. So if you click on your type block, And if you click right on that plus sign, you'll notice my cursor changed into a loaded cursor. That's what this is called, a loaded cursor. And with a loaded cursor, I can now click somewhere else. And I'm just going to click, notice if I've got my smart guides on, so when I come up here, I can see where that top edge is. I'm going to click and drag to make a second block of type. And if you'll, I'm going to zoom out, so what you'll see is my second block of type is linked to my first block. And Illustrator shows me this, and InDesign works in the same way. It shows me that I've got a little play symbol here, and I've got a line that leads from this type block to that one. So I can see that the overflow text in this box links to this next text block. And then, of course, I have more overflow. I'm not really concerned for getting all of the type on this page. I just wanted enough type that I could have overflow to show this off. So now I've got two columns. One is significantly larger than the other. I could always change the size of this column, right? And I could always change the size of this column. So I actually might have the space to make two kind of even text blocks. And I could measure it out. I could measure out even text blocks, or I could go, okay, 2 1/4, 3 1/4, 4 1/4, you know, try to figure out kind of mathematically how to have exactly even text blocks. Or I could also, you know, set this at what I'd like it to be. I do this all of the time because instead of counting, I kind of prefer to work with shapes. So I could say, well, that's as big as the first one, so let's see if I have room on the second one. Okay, that would be very tight, right? If I would have even text blocks and they were this size, that doesn't give me a whole lot of margin space on the right side. So I maybe have to go a little bit smaller than this if I want to have even text blocks. Now I'm getting like slightly less than my ideal 3 to 4 inches. So it might look a little small. So this is, you know, this is kind of your choice. I would probably be inclined to have one very large block and one smaller block, but if you wanted to have kind of even columns, you could do it. You could get there. And I could probably pull this over a little bit. I don't want to have too small of a space in the gutter. The gutter is the space between my columns. And I don't want to have too large of a space, right? So it should kind of set it up so that it's sort of easy to make the relationship that these are two columns that flow together. Now there are some other things that I want to watch out for as I'm working with my body copy. And all of this text would be considered body copy. One thing is, I don't want to have any widows or orphans, and I'm not seeing any right now, so that's kind of nice. I was sort of hoping I would get one by accident just to have that to show, but I want to watch out for that. A widow or an orphan is either a word that dangles at the end of a paragraph or a single word that dangles at the top of a column. So I don't have that happening. If I did, I would probably readjust the size of my type blocks, or I would readjust this sort of the line spacing there. Maybe force a new line. Another thing that I want to look at in here, I would not be concerned for kerning because my type size is so small. At 11 points or 10 points or 14 points even, 9 points, whatever, usually type is going to hold up pretty well. It's been kerned for that size, so I'm not worried about that. But I will think about my leading. So leading is the space between the lines of type. And I'm going to click in. Remember, if I click into my type, I want to see this cursor, right? So I'm going to click into here. And I'm just going to look at this. Now, this is sort of what I got automatically when I pasted my paragraphs in. Automatically, I got, and I'm just going to show it by doing this, I got a full kind of return between lines. That's what by default happened. And that is a lot of space, right? Like this space right here. I mean, if you look at the space between the lines and then you look at this, that's a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and shift. So my cursor is right here before the next paragraph starts. I'm going to hold the shift key and press the down arrow. That's just a fast way to select a line of type. I'll do that one more time. Shift down arrow. And then I will decrease my leading with Option up arrow. And I'm going to watch over here, just to keep an eye on it. This is my leading. So my default leading for 11 points is 13.2. That's what's coming up. So I'm going to just kind of work this a little bit. I did Option up arrow twice, and I kind of like this a little bit better. I'm happier with that. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of manually do that, and I'm just going to sort of see. And notice that by doing that, I actually put myself just about right on the line there, so that was kind of a happy accident. I'll come over here and do that to this line, Option up arrow twice. I want to have that same number, right? So I have 9.2 there, I have 9.2 there, and the same thing on this one, Shift down arrow, Option up arrow twice. Okay. Okay, now I have a couple of other things that I'd like to do. I want to set up my first line, or at least my first couple of words. Lorem ipsum. I'm just going to set this up in small caps, and I'm basically doing that just because I want to show that when you're working with type, you want to use, a lot of the variations that you can. And I'm using just one type family for this whole exercise, Gill Sans. I use the bold version in the top heading area. I'm using just the Gill Sans regular for my body copy. For these first couple of words, I'm going to choose, so I've selected with my type tool, I've just selected over those words by clicking and dragging. And then from the character pull-down menu, I'm going to choose small caps. And I'm also, while it's still selected, I'm also going to track this out a little bit with Option right arrow. And you'll see, look down here, my tracking is being set there. So I could do it numerically, but I just tend to use the hotkeys for as much as I can. Okay, this is a kind of common way, there's a lot of different ways that people set up maybe the first couple of words, especially in like a magazine layout, for a print layout. Or first couple words in a chapter of a book or something like that. You might see a drop cap, right? A really huge capital letter that drops down into the text. You might see small caps, just something to kind of set off those first few words. I'm also going to add to this piece a little tiny square. But I'm going to do that by making a relationship to the eye and grid. If you remember in the final piece, the eye and grid is a red square rather than a black circle, the dot over the eye. So I'm going to make that, and then I'll repeat it down here. For the most part, I'm pretty happy with my type. I could take this whole, everything, shift click those two boxes, and just nudge it down one little time to get my types resting on my baseline down here. And then over here, I'm basically a little bit out of luck in terms of meeting that line. I could take just this block and push it down, and so some people would prefer to have the text land on the same baseline on the page, and sort of would forego having the same kind of first line baseline on the page. So you could do it that way, or you could keep it up and have the same baseline at the top but have it not hit the bottom. So A or B is fine. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at that eye. And there's a couple of ways I could replace my circle dot on the eye with a square. I mean, the easiest, quickest thing I could do is just click and drag to make a box over the eye. And I'm holding the shift key so I get a perfect square. If I hold the space bar, I can reposition where that is so I can get it right exactly there. So I could just make a box like this and then go ahead and pick up, I could use one of these swatches, or I could go into my colors, and I could use, you know, something from here, okay, something like that. So that's the easiest maybe way to do that. Notice you may see a tiny bit of circle back there, so maybe I have to make this just a little tiny bit bigger. Okay, my opinion is that's kind of the cheating way. It would work. I mean, if you printed this out, you wouldn't see the circle behind the eye. But I would rather actually delete that circle and then replace it with the square. So because I want to delete the circle, I need to sort of break apart my text. And because I'm going to break apart my text, I'm going to make a copy. I'm selecting everything, and that's fine. And then I'm just, with my selection tool and the option key, I'm going to click and drag to make a copy of grid systems and put that over there. I always like to hold on to my vector type. So this is just vector type on a path, because now I'm going to Command-Shift-G and ungroup my type from the block, or I could also have selected all of that and selected Object Ungroup. And now I'm going to select my type and choose from the Type menu, Create Outlines. Create Outlines transforms my type from type on a path to individual type shapes. And so now I can actually see all the little dots that go around, all the little anchor points that go around every shape. With my direct selection tool, I could, for instance, click and drag over just the top of the D. And if I wanted to, I could shift up arrow a few times to transform the shape of that D. I don't recommend transforming the shape of letters with great frequency. I think that letters are typically designed very well by type designers, and they shouldn't really be messed with. But I'm doing this just to show that a letter really is a shape. And when it comes down to it, a letter is a shape, and it's made of anchor points just like any other shape, and it can be transformed just like any other shape. So if I zoom in here, I'm just going to click one anchor point on the dot of that eye, and if I press delete, delete, I can get rid of the whole shape. So now I can use my rectangle tool. I'm going to put this right on top of the eye. I'm going to grab, I kind of liked, in that color guide, I liked that one, that color of red, that shade of red, so I'm going to go with that. And then I'll shift up arrow and kind of zoom out and take a look at this. So I feel like that dot is a little too big. I know it's exactly the same sort of width as the letter I, the letter form for the I, but I just feel like it's a little too large. So I'm going to double click on my scale tool. And when I double click, I can scale, you know, uniform scale. I'm going to scale it by 75%. So that's just a 25% reduction. And I feel like that maybe has a little bit of a better relationship. So again, shift up arrow once, and then I'm going to bring it down 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I just feel like that's a little better looking. Now I'm going to take that same red dot. I'm going to zoom in so I can see where my cursor is. Hold the option key with the selection tool. That gives me the sort of duplicate object tool, and click and drag. And then I'm going to put this right along the line and right above my lorem ipsum text. So I'm going to zoom in again. You really have to zoom in to see what you're doing. and I'm going to go ahead and put it. Now, if I wanted to, I could put it above the text, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe something like that to make that relationship on the page. I could also put it at the very start, right there along the baseline. And then I would click in. If I wanted to do that, I would click in, and I could use the space bar to nudge this over. And if I feel like the space ended up pushing it over too far, I actually think it looks fine. But if this was too far, I could then use Option left arrow to kern this back, or Option right arrow to kern it over. Okay. When you feel like you're done, I guess the last thing I didn't really look at, which I should just for good measure, I should take a look at what's going on in this space. So I have my gutter space, which looks like this, and I'm interested in the width, not so much the height. And then I have my margin space. And so I can see, I'm just sort of curious, my margin space, it's a little bit larger than my gutter space. I think that's totally fine. I would rather have it be a little bit larger than smaller. So it's kind of good to check that out. If it were way off, I might make some adjustments. If this were much larger than this, I would definitely make adjustments, but something like this I think is absolutely fine. Command semicolon will hide my guides, and I'm going to do a file save as. I'm going to save my native file. I'm just going to put this right on the desktop, gridsystems.ai, and I'll press OK to save it in Illustrator 6 CS6 format. And then I will also choose File Save As, and I will save this also as a PDF. Now, when I press Save, I'm going to see the PDF dialog box, and there are a couple of things in here that you should know about. You should know about choosing your PDF compatibility. So this is not a super big deal if you're just printing this out on your home printer. But there are certain printers, professional printers, who you may work with, who may ask you for a specific Acrobat PDF compatibility. So if you need to change that, that's going to be in this menu. I'm not even going to fuss with it. I mean, I could put it, I have Acrobat, I think 9 installed on my computer or something like that. So I could put it at the compatibility for the latest version, and that would work for me. You may want to view your PDF after saving. I usually don't check that because I don't always necessarily want to open up Acrobat as I'm working. What you may want to do, and I think this is probably the most important part, is over here in marks and bleeds, sometimes it's nice to turn on your trim marks. That would give you, in Acrobat, would give you little tiny crop marks or trim marks to show you where the size of your page should be, so that if you were planning to trim your paper, you would have crop marks there to show those to you. So I often turn on trim marks. And then the other thing is sometimes, and I'm not going to do this here, I didn't actually include any images, so compression is really a non-issue for me, but if you had included images, you may want to compress them. So if you were making this PDF to print, you would probably not want to downsample anything. But if you were saving the same file for the web, for viewers on the web, then you may want to save a secondary PDF where you do actually do some average downsampling to 72 dots per inch, so that you were kind of working in screen resolution for viewers on the web. That would just make your file size much smaller. So I'm not going to worry about compression for this. I'll leave my trim marks on just for the heck of it, and then I'll save my PDF. If I look on my desktop, my PDF is going to be there. And if I would open this, I'm going to open it. I'm actually going to open it in preview because I just want to get a quick preview. And you'll see there are the trim marks, right? So these are the trim marks that show me if I wanted to cut the page out to exactly 8.5 by 11, this is where I would need to trim. And I've got them on the top and I've got them on the bottom as well.